Evening, folks. Hopefully this is working for everybody. Can see a few people have logged in, which is excellent. Oh, yep, and Nicholas has just messaged me to say that things are coming across loud and clear, which is excellent news. So we'll pretend we're at university and we're just waiting for students to turn up late. So we'll just give it a minute and see who turns up for us. Oh, yeah, we've got 11 people now. This is fantastic. Okay, so I guess we should get going. It's 1 minute past, and we can see how we get on. So thank you everybody for turning up. It's absolutely fantastic, especially you know, given the time of evening, 8 o'clock here in Leicester and 9 o'clock there in Gibraltar for many people. I'm going to treat this as a little bit of a social, you know, given that normally we would be in a social venue. So I have my little beer here, so I hope you'll excuse me for taking the odd sip. And what I'm going to do today is to talk about Hayek's report on Gibraltar, which is called very plainly Some Economic Problems of Gibraltar. But this hides a very dramatic story. One that, you know, ends ultimately in the kind of future of Gibraltar being utterly changed in terms of what post-war, post-Second World War governance looks like in Gibraltar. So the first thing to say about this, okay, we've got this report, Some Economic Problems of Gibraltar, by this economist Friedrich Hayek. Okay, why is it important? Well, there's two reasons. The first one is that if you look at histories of Gibraltar, often very little is said about the 1940s. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's daft. There's lots of stuff being done on the evacuation. And of course, that happened in the 1940s. And this is true. But the point is, of course, is that, you know, when you look at a history of the evacuation, it takes us away from Gibraltar. You know, it takes us to Madeira, it takes us to Jamaica, it takes us to Northern Ireland, it takes us to London. The focus, therefore, being away from what's going on in Gibraltar. Actually, if you look at histories of Gibraltar, there's been not so much done on what's going on in terms of post-war planning, you know, what is this place going to look like after the war, and so on and so forth. And, you know, really, in histories of Gibraltar, it's kind of like the war ends, and then there's the Legislative Council in the early 1950s. Not an awful lot has been done on the 1940s in Gibraltar. And Hayek's report is taking place at this 1944, at a crucial moment where the British authorities and the colonial authorities in London are thinking to themselves, okay, what are we going to do with Gibraltar after the war? How is it going to look like? How are we going to organise it economically? How are we going to tackle the challenges of expensive housing, high cost of living? What are we going to do in terms of wages? What are we going to do in terms of matching them to the heightened cost of living caused by the war? So all those issues have been taken care of. So that's one reason to look at Hayek's report. The second reason to look at it is because, and I don't blame anybody who isn't up on their 20th century economists, but the second reason to look at it is that Hayek is an incredibly famous economist. I mean, he is, you know, in 1944, he is pretty much second, although in his memoirs he thinks he's first, in my opinion, he's pretty much second to John Maynard Keynes. Here we have this legendary economist. I actually dug it out. Here is my copy of Hayek's book, published in the same year that he comes to Gibraltar to do this report, Some Economic Problems of Gibraltar. He publishes his book, The Road to Serfdom. And this is from the 60s, multiple editions later. You couldn't get hold of this book during the war. In 1944, because of paper rationing, it sold out that quickly that people couldn't even get hold of the book. It sold millions worldwide. And as recently as 2010, it was top of the Amazon bestsellers list. When Obamacare came in America, and a lot of kind of right-wing libertarians were worried about the creeping state and what this meant, a lot of them reached for this book, The Road to Serfdom, and read up about, Hayek's ideas on the state and on economies. He won the Nobel Prize in 1974, was made a member of the Companion of Honor, the highest civilian award in the UK in the early 80s, won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the US in 1991. Enormously well respected. There's a story that Hayek, his book, The Constitution of Liberty, was one of Margaret Thatcher's favourite books, and there's a story that Thatcher goes to a policy meeting in the 1970s where a kind of policy wonk is outlining, what he thinks the Conservative Party should be doing in the 1980s, what we're going to do in the new decade. And Thatcher listens for about 5 minutes, and then she reaches into her handbag and withdraws a copy of Hayek, plonks it down on the table and says, "This is what we believe." So Hayek's been really, instrumental in politics in the UK and in the United States, really kind of important economist. So there's these two reasons to look at Hayek's report. On the one hand, what's going on in Gibraltar in the 1940s in terms of post-war planning, and on the other hand, what is going on here with this really famous economist turning up in Gibraltar? And I'll give a spoiler here, the report he produces is rejected, and in fact it's that controversial, it's suppressed by the colonial authorities. They refuse to publish it. So that raises a subsidiary question of what on earth did he say in this report that was so controversial that ended up with it being suppressed? How does a great economist get it so wrong that they end up in this situation of having their report suppressed? So that's what I'm going to talk about over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. Okay. So first question is, how does Hayek end up in Gibraltar? So one of the things when you read the history of Gibraltar is very often it's argued, because of the slow return of the evacuees after the Second World War, it's often argued that the colonial authorities were quite negligent towards Gibraltar. And I'm certainly not going to argue that that wasn't the case, because in terms of the evacuation, it was painfully slow in terms of repatriation. With that said, after 1943, once the Italy campaign is won, the colonial authorities do seriously turn their mind towards planning post-war Gibraltar. And they do a lot of work on this, and it really fits into the zeitgeist of the time. This is the era of planning. This is the era where John Maynard Keynes' economic ideas are coming to the fore, the idea that the state can and should interfere in economies, the idea that you can plan demographics, that you can think about population size, and you can use that to plan for the future. This is the era of the new towns, hideous in many ways, but places like Milton Keynes, this is the era of state planning. This is also the era of the Beveridge Report. This is the era of thinking about social security, a universal social security in the UK. NHS is set up at this period, and the Colonial Office is really clear that they want the Beveridge Report proposals rolled out across the empire. And in part that's because What they're really worried about is the United States effectively closing down the empire very quickly as being kind of retrograde and problematic. What the UK government is trying to do is say, well, hang on, there's a kind of sense of trusteeship here, and what we're doing is responsibly bringing along these territories and kind of modernising them. So they're really trying to push out to the empire the state planning that is going on in the UK. And so in Gibraltar, what the government of Gibraltar does is write to the Colonial Office and say, we want an expert sending. You know, this is not the era of Michael Gove. You know, this is, we've had enough of experts. It's not like that at all. This is an era of experts. If we think about what's going on in Gibraltar in terms of education, this is when H.W. Howes is brought over as the first director of education, where we start to see professional input into the government of Gibraltar. Whereas in the past, of course, you know, it had been kind of the governor's whims go. Now we've got a kind of professional kind of civil service really turning its attentions to what post-war Gibraltar is going to look like. And so they write to the Colonial Office and say, look, send us somebody, send us an expert. And the Colonial Office writes to the London School of Economics, where Hayek is based. It's in exile, so to speak, in Cambridge because of the Blitz in London. And says, can you send a PhD student to come and do us a report on the economy of Gibraltar? And, as you might expect, the answer is, the letter gets to Hayek, and Hayek responds and says, well, there's a war on, and so there's no PhD students here, but I will come and do it for you. And the reason why he's free is because he was Austrian, he'd served in the Austrian army in the First World War, and so he was ineligible for service, even though he was naturalised as British afterwards. He was still ineligible, having served in the Austrian army in the First World War. So he kind of saw this as a kind of war work, you know, as he did indeed the book The Road to Serfdom. He saw this as being, you know, his doing his bit for the UK. And so off he goes to Gibraltar to write this report on the Gibraltar economy. And there's kind of 4 parts to the report, but I'm going to stick to the 4th one, which is this roadmap of the economy of Gibraltar that Hayek outlines for post-war. And so he goes around Gibraltar and he talks to all sorts of people. He's trying to work out, you know, is there going to be a population growth after the war? Do we need to account for that? To the point where I'm just rereading some of the stuff I've written about this, and I only just remembered this. He even goes into chemists in Gibraltar and starts inquiring about purchases of condoms, and have they gone up? You know, does this mean that therefore there's more family planning going on in Gibraltar, and maybe the birth rate's going to decrease after the war and stuff like this? I mean, it's incredibly thorough, the detail that he goes into, and he talks to all sorts of interested groups. And just remember this one detail for the end of this, because this is really important in terms of why the report is suppressed. He also talks to the AACR, which of course at this point is very embryonic, very early doors. But despite the AACR, of course, being set up to facilitate the repatriation of the evacuees, they're also getting involved in questions about work and about housing and all those kinds of issues. So the ACI is already being involved in the kind of the politics of government. They're not just an evacuation party, even whilst the war is going on. So Hayek goes and talks to them. And being a kind of old-fashioned scholar, he doesn't tell them what his proposals are going to be. This is part of the problem as to why the whole thing gets suppressed. But he just assures them that he's got a plan, and that the plan that he's got will make things better for people in Gibraltar. And he leaves them with that. And so he goes off. And he does his investigations, and he goes back to the UK, and he starts writing some economic problems from of Gibraltar. It's quite interesting that there's a note in his biography. We know, for example, that Hayek returned to the UK with a small cask of sherry that he bought from Saconian Speed, and that he held a party and invited his friends round when he returned, and they broke open this cask of sherry, and then they had their party, and then he set about writing the report. Okay, so what did the report say? So one of the problems before the Second World War in Gibraltar, and I guess continuing because of the limited space, if we're being honest, is the price of rents. During the First World War, there had been controls on rents in Gibraltar. After the war, there had been an attempt to carry that on, but after fierce resistance from what I call the moneyed class of Gibraltar, but you know what we might broadly speaking call the entrepreneurial community, you know, people who own the buildings that get rented out. After a lot of resistance from them, those rent controls are lifted. And so the cost of rents goes up and up and up. And there's a real battle between the colonial authorities and the moneyed class in Gibraltar, where the colonial authorities are trying desperately to impose legislation to keep rents down, but they're resisted in this cat and mouse game through the Executive Council and the City Council, where the kind of moneyed class representatives managed to hold off rent restriction for about 18 years. And so it's just about at the point where the war breaks out that they managed to bring in rent restriction. It's resisted even then, and then once the war breaks out and the governor effectively has unilateral powers, he just slaps down a rent restriction ordinance and holds the rents at about 25% of pre-war levels. So this is the first problem. We've got really high cost of rents, very poor quality housing, you know, a lot of slum housing. You know, Steve Constantine's book on Gibraltar tackles this. That's made even worse by the treatment of that housing by the soldiers that are billeted in there. We've got very little in terms of what we would call council housing in the UK, very little public kind of housing. We've also got increasing prices. Hayek produces a cost of living survey and demonstrates kind of what everybody already knew, which is the cost of living is going through the roof in Gibraltar because of rising prices for food. And so, you know, we've got that. We've got a really big state sector. Roughly half of the people in Gibraltar are employed either in the Admiralty Dockyard or by the colonial government. And this for Hayek is a nightmare scenario. So he's turning up, he finds this place whereby you've got rent restrictions, you've got high cost of living, which the government is trying to deal with by a kind of minimum wage. And you've got this very big, you know, these days a conservative minister would call it bloated public sector, you know, with most, you know, over 50% of people being employed by the colonial government. Now, okay, why does Hayek think that's a problem? And here we need a little bit of economics, and I'm going to explain, but there'll be no maths, I assure you. I'm going to put this in very plain terms. What Hayek realizes, what Hayek's economics is about the state and the role of the state in economies. And Hayek's belief is that the state should act as, to use the phrase from Adam Smith, a night watchman. That it should be very minimal, very hands-off, that decision-making within economies should be left to the invisible hand of the market, not the visible hand of the state. You know, it's not about states getting in there and doing stuff. It's about allowing markets to determine, you know, what it is that people think is important. And Hayek sees this as a real point of principle. This is for him how liberty, you know, is guaranteed. This is why the book is called The Road to Serfdom. He's saying if you let the states decide what is important, then, you know, this is the road to servitude. That actually what the free market allows, when every day, as we do now, we buy something, it's like a referendum, he's saying. What happens is we say what we prize, you know, and what we're prepared to pay for it. And so resources are allocated effectively and efficiently in this kind of economy, but also democratically. Because, you know, what we're saying is look, you know, we'll pay £1 for a Kit Kat, for example. Other confectionaries are available, but we won't, pay £10 for one. So we've said what we think the value of, cocoa products is at that stage. And so this is kind of a referendum through millions and millions of purchases that are going on, if not billions, every day. It's like a referendum on what we think is important. So for Hayek, this is all about the small state. And in Gibraltar, what is increasingly happening is the big state, the state being over 50% of the employer, rent restrictions, proposals for lots of kind of state housing after the Second World War. And Hayek doesn't like this at all. And what he sets about to do is to counterbalance this and to put forward a vision for post-war Gibraltar that brings in the free market. And this then requires a kind of leap on Hayek's part, a kind of intellectual leap in terms of how you think about the Gibraltar economy, and in particular, how you think about Gibraltar's relationship with the Campo. So, what Hayek says is, he says, Gibraltar really isn't an economy in and of itself. What he says is, you've got to think about Gibraltar as what he calls a greater Gibraltar. And he says you've got Gibraltar that is effectively an urban centre, a bit like London acts to the UK. And then what we've got is the Campo, where there's lots of Gibraltarians living at the time, as we know. And he says, effectively what we've got here is a kind of city-suburb setup. And then he says, well, if we look over the border, if we look over the frontier, what we see is cheaper housing. We see lower cost of living. There's no need for rent restriction in La Linea. The housing is cheap enough. There's no need for minimum wages imposed by the Admiralty. And so he says, actually, that's pretty good. So he says, what we should really do is not worry too much about cost of rents in Gibraltar. What we should do is we should remove rent restrictions. We should allow the cost of rents in Gibraltar to go through the roof. This will price out of the market the average Gibraltarian, who will then be forced to move into neighbouring Spain. And then effectively Gibraltar will be emptied out of Gibraltarians, other than the very rich, and they'll be moved into Spain. And I'm going to come to Nicholas's question in the chat there in a minute about resistance. The answer is no, because nobody ever found out about this proposal. So Hayek's proposal is you remove rent restriction, you imagine Gibraltar as a bigger Gibraltar that incorporates not just a vision of what the city of Gibraltar looks like, but also its hinterland. He even proposes setting up kind of what we would now call a public-private finance initiative to set up housing in the Campo for Gibraltarians, to allow the free market in rents to rule effectively, so that the free market would deliver people from Gibraltar into Spain. And this is when he talks to the AACR and he says, I've got a plan that's going to make everything better for you. This is the plan, but he doesn't tell them that. So in the report, he says to the colonial authorities, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to price Gibraltarians out of living into Gibraltar, and you need to move them into Spain. And then we can get rid of all this rent restriction and all these kind of government interferences that Hayek doesn't like. And he submits the report, and then he goes to America. He goes on a tour to publicise the road to serfdom. And it's incredibly successful. And in fact, Hayek moves to the US not long after. He moves in 1949 to Chicago. So there's two things really to finish up with here. So the first question is, how does this proposal to move Gibraltarians from Gibraltar into Spain using the free market. How does that compare with Hayek's writing in The Road to Serfdom? And then the second question, kind of why does virtually nobody know this story? Why is the publication suppressed? I'll answer that one. So the answer to the first question is this. It reflects terribly on The Road to Serfdom. So Hayek's argument in The Road to Serfdom is that we should prize the free market, that liberal economies are virtuous, they are guarantors of democracy and liberty. But Hayek's proposing moving people via the free market into Spain. Well, Spain is an autarky at this point. Now, an autarky, in case you don't know, is an economy where you try and produce everything you need within that economy. This is Franco's economic policy from 1939 till 1959. It's disastrous for Spain. I mean, clearly Spain is not self-sufficient and cannot be self-sufficient and causes mass poverty through this. So, okay, Hayek's commitment to the free market on the one hand is there, but he's moving people away from, what is effectively, a liberal economy in Gibraltar into this autarkic economy in Spain. So this is a complete contradiction with what Hayek's saying in The Road to Serfdom. And, if we're going to make a broader point about what does this mean for Hayek's kind of political economy, what I would say is I think that Hayek very rarely writes any reports for government. He only does 4 in his life, and the Gibraltar one is one of them. And it really seems as though, when it comes to it and he's got a practical suggestion to make, he doesn't really care that much about liberty. And I think what he's prepared to do to Gibraltarians is shown. He's more about the theory in terms of economics, and he's not very good on what the practice is. So, the fact that we have this proposal by Hayek in the same year that he writes The Road to Serfdom, I think, begins to undermine the case in The Road to Serfdom for Hayek being a kind of liberal and kind of advocate for democracy. And then, of course, why does this fall apart? And it's easy, of course, to be cynical about the UK government, and it's easy to be cynical about the Colonial Office. But they're horrified by this report. I mean, they're utterly horrified. The best the governor can say about this is he says, well, look, if we've got a problem in terms of overpopulation, then, we will look at moving people to other British colonies or to the UK. And of course, the UK does this itself after the Second World War. It pays, it subsidises people to be able to move to Australia. He says, we'd investigate that. But he says, there's no way we're moving people, against their will out of Gibraltar into Spain. It's just not happening. And the Colonial Office is horrified as well. They call Hayek in, the permanent secretary, who is pretty much God in a government department, calls Hayek in and says, look, you've got to change the conclusions in this report. There's no way we can publish it as it is. And Hayek refuses. You've got to remember, Hayek is a superstar by this stage. He's been to the United States. He's done this tour. The book is selling millions at this point. And, he's come back from America, and the Colonial Office has called him in and said, this isn't happening, mate. What's going on? This is dreadful. But he refuses to back this. He says, no way I'm changing this. And so the report stands. And the colonial authorities are stuck because, on the one hand, Hayek has told the ACR that his proposals will benefit the people of Gibraltar. On the other hand, they can't publish the report because they know if they publish it, there's going to be a suspicion that what's in the report is what the colonial authorities want, and it definitely isn't. So they say, look, we're going to have to suppress this report. So then there's this big rally by the ACR, and they march on the convent, which, if anybody is watching who isn't from Gibraltar, is kind of Gibraltar's government house. This is, where the governor resides. And they march on the convent and they say, well, look, you've suppressed this report. It must say things like a higher minimum wage. It must say things like cheap housing. And the colonial authorities realised that they can't deny this, but it's not true. And so they basically have to fold to the ACR's demands on housing and planning of housing. They have to fold on free education. They have to fold on minimum wages. They have to fold on index linking, increases in rents to inflation as well as wages. And so effectively, the really, really heavily planned post-war Gibraltar economy comes about precisely because the colonial authorities have to fold to pressure to bring it about in order to distract from the fact that Hayek's report is saying that none of this should happen. And so it really is the law of unintended consequences. What you've got here is one of the biggest advocates of the small state, of the free market, putting forward proposals that usher in a fairly big state in Gibraltar and lots of restrictions on the free market. And that effectively is the end of our tale. And it's remarkable that such a famous economist becomes completely unstuck by his own thinking, really. And it's a question, did he not understand Gibraltar properly? I think there's probably a good argument about that. But I think there's also, a lot of arrogance there as well. Hayek really just thought that he whatever he said, people would go with. And of course, after the war, actually his brand of economics falls apart, and Keynes's economics comes into fashion, and Hayek kind of flees almost to Chicago, and in the United States he's thought of much more fondly. So that's the end of our story, basically. I can see the comments in the chat. If anybody's got any questions about either Hayek and the report or 1940s Gibraltar, or any comments or anything about what I've said, please do feel free to put that in the chat, and I'll happily answer. But to come back to Nicholas's question, there isn't resistance from Gibraltarians because the report is suppressed. Because the colonial authorities are terrified of this getting out. Oh, you're welcome, Becky. You're very welcome, Christian. You're welcome. And Francis. Well, I did do a couple of articles on this, so if anybody does feel the need to know more, you can feel free to just Google my name. You'll find my staff page, and feel free to send me an email, and I'll happily send things on to you. Oh, governor at the time. So now you'll be. This is like a test. It's like kings and queens of Britain, isn't it? It's Eastwood. There we are. Who, of course, later gets himself in hot water for trying to pass a finance bill without permission. You're welcome, Andrew. Oh, thanks, Rob. Yeah, and this is kind of governors of Gibraltar. It's a bit like kings and queens of Britain. I mean, Sir William Jackson even puts the governors at the top of each chapter of his book. As though kind of who's the governor kind of matters, and it does matter actually, but it also matters kind of what's going on in the colonial secretariat in Gibraltar, and also what's going on in the Colonial Office in London as well. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is what I do when I'm teaching is knock this on the head. Numbers are slowly decreasing, and very nice messages, but without any questions coming in, I think it's time to draw this to a close. Like I say, if you've got any questions, or if you want to read more about this, just Google my name, you'll see my staff page, and just send me an email. I'm more than happy to send stuff on to you. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.